Welcome to Fixing iOS Apps That Nobody's Asked Me to Fix, but then I'm going to fix anyways. Today's contestant, Disneyland. Disneyland, are you ready to get fixed?
I sure am, Bryce.
Okay, geez, none of that. This is way too new of a channel for us to be dealing with Disney's lawyers. My fiance and I have Disneyland passes. We'll go there on occasion to hang out with family or go on a date night, so we end up using the Disneyland app a lot. Naturally, my favorite part of the app is anything that has to do with acquiring food. But there's been an issue recently, which is that when you click in to look at a restaurant and then you try to navigate back, the whole app ends up freezing. You can't swipe, you can't tap. The only thing you can do is force quit the whole app and try again. Based on some quick tests, I think it's only when you try to swipe to navigate backwards, but that muscle memory is strong for me, and last time I was at the park, I ended up doing this like 5 times. So I'm curious if, as outsiders, we can crack open the Disneyland app, poke around and figure out what's wrong, and maybe come up with a fix. So I'm going to be using the latest version of the Disneyland app running on a jailbroken iPhone, and I'm going to go ahead and launch it, and then attach a debugger to it. We'll tell LLDB we're using a remote iOS device, and then connect over USB. I've seen a couple people ask how to set up a jailbroken device for something like this. If you're interested in that, please let me know. But for now, our debugger is attached, so I'm going to go ahead and continue execution, and now let's try to reproduce the freeze. So I'm going to go and pretend like I'm making dining reservations, and we'll go and request a reservation sometime in the future. Now, if I tap on one of these items and I try to swipe backwards, my touch preview is no longer working, but you can see that I can no longer scroll and I can't tap any of these buttons, so we've reproduced the freeze. So given we're seeing a full freeze that doesn't resolve on its own, I'm curious if we're either triggering an infinite loop on the main thread or we've otherwise set up some sort of deadlock. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-C in the debugger to see where we're stopped by now running BT for backtrace. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this over to Sublime so that we can read it a little bit better. So here's where we're stopped, and this actually looks slightly different than what I would have expected. There's no Disneyland related frames on the stack at all. These top ones all look related to just pausing the app in the debugger in the first place. And down here is just the base of the app's normal run loop. So I don't see an infinite loop in Disney's code here or any indication that we're deadlocked. This actually looks exactly like what I would expect if you just paused the normal app while it wasn't doing anything. Let's try to get some more data. I'm going to open instruments and I'm going to use the time profiler to get a better look at what's happening across all the threads and see if there's somehow something we're missing. So I'm going to go ahead and launch using instruments and then again navigate back to where the freeze happens, and I'm going to tap into a restaurant and then try to swipe back, and we'll watch in instruments here. So the thing is once again frozen. Can't tap on anything. And I'm going to go ahead and stop for now. And if I go ahead and expand this bottom section, we can see that the main thread is only about 10% busy. And actually none of the other threads are really busy either. Maybe we're not actually frozen right now. So let's do this. I'm going to come back to the debugger and I'm going to ask our key window for its recursive description to just print out everything on the screen. And perfect. I'm going to go ahead and copy this back to Sublime so we can see it better. So now we have a printout of all the contents of our key window, and there's a lot here. So to help orient ourselves, I'm going to come back to the phone screen and I'm going to look for a couple distinctive features here, like these labels, Cafe Orleans, Disneyland Park. This is perfect. So I'm going to come back to Sublime and I'm going to search for that first one, Cafe Orleans. And we can see that here's that label and then here's that Disneyland Park label right below it. And okay, here's our problem. If we look at where this label lives, it's part of these stack views, which are part of this table view cell, which is part of this table view, which is part of this UI parallax dimming view. And if we scroll over, we can see that that parallax dimming view has user interaction enabled set to no. And everything currently on the screen lives under this view. So that's super funny. We're not actually frozen. The entire view controller is just declining to accept user input at this point. So I assume that this UI parallax dimming view is inserted by iOS whenever we do this swipe transition, which yes, it looks like if I reset the app to just before the freeze and then dump the window contents again, we see a similar thing, but without that parallax dimming view. So it feels like what's happening is that iOS is correctly recognizing this swipe. It's starting a navigation transition. It wraps the dismissing view controller in this dimmer view and disables interaction on it so that the user isn't accidentally interacting with the view as it's going away. And all that makes sense and sounds good, but then somewhere in the app we are effectively canceling that transition, and we're left in this bad state where the navigation hasn't finished, but the view controller still can't be interacted with. So I'm trying to think of ways that we might be accidentally interfering with this transition, and the two that come to mind are messing with the gesture recognizer that's powering it, or maybe implementing our own custom transition where some of the logic is broken. I want to look at the gesture recognizer side of things first. So I know you can access this gesture recognizer by calling interactive pop gesture recognizer on your navigation controller. So it's possible that there's some code that's looking at that gesture recognizer and doing weird things like forcing it to fail because some other gesture was triggered. I think right now I'm curious if that gesture recognizer has a delegate and if that delegate's doing anything weird. So back in our window printout, I want to find the root view for our view controller. I think this is probably it given it's the super view of this table view below it. And I'm going to come back to LLDB and I'm going to ask that view, just by using its address here, for its next responder. And if this is the root view for our view controller, that should give us the view controller instance itself. And perfect, we get a WDPR Finder UI detail view controller out. Now I'm going to ask that view controller for its its navigation controller. And now we should be able to use that navigation controller to get the interactive pop gesture recognizer for this transition. And we can see that the name of this gesture recognizer class matches pretty closely with the name of that dimming view we saw earlier. So that's probably a good sign. Now I'm gonna go ahead and ask that gesture recognizer for its delegate. And we get the same stack view controller instance that we saw up here when we asked for our navigation controller. Maybe the navigation controller is always the delegate for a gesture recognizer like this. I'm not actually sure. But now I'm curious if this view controller class implements any of the gesture recognizer delegate methods. Because if so, that might be where it's interacting with this gesture in a problematic way. So what I want to do next is look at this view controller's implementation in a disassembler. So I'm going to start with a decrypted copy of the Disneyland app, which you can dump from a jailbroken phone or find online. And as always, IPA files are secretly just zip files. So I'm going to go ahead and rename it to a zip and then extract it. Now we saw in terminal that this view controller belongs to a module called WDPR UI kit. So I want to look through the contents of this IPA file. And I'm going to look in the frameworks directory, and what we should see is this WDPR UI kit here. So I'm just going to double click into that, and then somewhere down here we should have the actual binary for this framework. And I'm going to go ahead and take my disassembler. I'm using IDA today, and I'm just going to drag this binary file in here. All of these defaults should be okay, and cool, IDA is doing its thing now. So I'm going to come over here to our list of function names in this binary, and I'm going to add a filter to find any method names that include that view controller class name that we're looking for. And now we can see all of that class's methods over here. And I'm actually going to add one more filter, and we're just going to say if it has gesture in the name, then highlight it, because I think all the gesture recognizer delegate methods do. And this second one is just a very short Objective-C stub for this first one, so we're going to mainly look at this first one. And I'm going to go ahead and look at a decompilation of this method. And the very first thing this method does is call out to interactive pop gesture recognizer. So again, back in LLDB, this is the gesture recognizer that's responsible for handling this transition. And we're trying to see if any of its delegates methods might be messing with it. And the very first thing we see in the decompilation is a call to interactive pop gesture recognizer. So this might indeed be where something's wrong. And the decompilation isn't super clean, but we can maybe piece together what's happening. It looks like we're getting our interactive pop gesture recognizer. We're probably checking if it's equal to the gesture recognizer that was passed into this method. Like we only want to do the code below if we're looking at this interactive pop gesture recognizer. Now remember, this is a navigation controller. So when we call out here the view controllers, we're asking that navigation controller for its list of view controllers. And then I think we're probably just getting the count of those view controllers, and we're checking if it's less than 2 here. And if it is, we're going to end up returning a value of 0, which makes sense. If we only have one view controller in the stack, then we don't want to allow swipe to dismiss, because what are we even dismissing to? And otherwise, we're looking at an IVAR on our navigation controller called push animation ongoing, which sounds a little bit more suspicious, but still probably makes sense. Like if we're currently pushing a view controller onto the screen, don't allow us to swipe back away from that view controller until that animation is completed. And for all other gesture recognizers, just return 1 to indicate that yes, it's okay that they begin. Nothing here immediately jumps out as problematic to me, but we can still check pretty easily. And we can do that with some quick code injections. So I'm gonna go ahead and open Xcode, and we're gonna create a new iOS framework that we're gonna inject into the Disneyland app to change some of its internals. I'm gonna call it Disney Freeze Fix, and I'm gonna use Objective-C for the language because that makes interacting with the Objective-C runtime just a little bit easier. And let's start with just an empty class implementation. Now I'm gonna add a load method to that class to be invoked whenever this framework is loaded. And then I'm gonna add a quick log statement, and then we're gonna swizzle some things. So let's start by defining the class that we want to swizzle, which is this WDPR stack view controller. Now we'll create a variable for the selector that we want to swizzle, which is gesture recognizer should begin. And I'm going to define a replacement implementation of that method down here. And now we can grab the selector for that replacement implementation. Now I'm going to use a very similar swizzling setup to what we used when looking at TikTok before, which is to get a reference to this new method we're adding and then add it to Disneyland's navigation controller class, almost like the Disneyland developers wrote this method themselves. And then once we've done that, we can do a more normal swizzling setup where we get the original method, we get the method that we just added to this class, and then we swap the two. So you can definitely check the TikTok video for a more detailed explanation there. The end result is that on this view controller, instead of its own gesture recognizer should begin implementation being called, we should call into this new implementation instead. Now we need to actually implement this method. So one thing we could do in this method is get this interactive pop gesture recognizer ourselves and check if this is the gesture recognizer that the delegate method is asking about, similar to the original disassembled method. And if it is, just return no, just preventing this gesture entirely. And otherwise we can fall back to our original response. So this just disables swiping back entirely. So before anything else, I want to check if this is a valid workaround for the issue. So I'm gonna go ahead and build this, and I'm gonna go to product, show build folder in Finder, and I'm gonna find the framework we just created. And now I'm gonna open Sideloadly, which we've seen on this channel before. It's a super easy way to inject frameworks into apps. And I'm just gonna go ahead and pick our Disneyland IPA, and then I'm gonna say inject a framework into it, and I'm just gonna choose this framework that we built in Xcode, and now hit start. Cool, so let's switch back to the iPhone. I'm also gonna open a console window so we can see the logs that we added. And now if we launch the app, we should see a log message saying that our framework has been loaded. Looks like it has. And now if I go tap on a restaurant, what I expect to see is that if I swipe back, nothing happens, but at least the app doesn't freeze. And that is indeed what we're seeing. We can see these console logs appearing every time I try to swipe and it's rejected by the framework. And this back button still works. So that's good. Like, if nothing else, this is a bare minimum change we can make in this app to at least stop it from getting in a bad state where you have to quit the whole thing. And that's cool, but I'm still curious what's actually broken here. And if you are too, then remember to subscribe. This is a new channel and it helps me a ton, so thank you. Now, let's see if we can actually come up with a fix. So I'm still curious if the original implementation of this method is what's causing the freeze or if something later down the pipeline is. So I'm going to change our replacement implementation so that instead of always ignoring this gesture recognizer, we always allow it. And that'll help us narrow down where the issue is. If this works, then that means there's something wrong with the original implementation of this method, possibly in this push animation ongoing check. If this doesn't work and things still freeze, then there's something else messing with this gesture recognizer further down the line. So I'm gonna go ahead and build, and I'm gonna install another build with sideloadly. And now let's try to reproduce the freeze again. I'm gonna swipe back, and we're frozen again. So that means our issue is not in the implementation of this method, it's somewhere further down the line. So one thing we can do is look for other places that are talking to this gesture recognizer, which is something we can do with the debugger. So I'm going to reset the app back to the state before the freeze, and then I'm going to come over here in LLDB and pause execution. And now I'm going to set a breakpoint on UI Navigation Controller Interactive Pop Gesture Recognizer because I want to see what places are actually calling out to this method. So we've set that breakpoint. I'm going to go ahead and continue, and then we're going to try to reproduce the freeze by swiping back. So I'm going to go ahead and hit BT for backtrace to see what the stack trace leading up to this call is. And it looks like this first call is actually from the framework we wrote. Remember, we have a call to Interactive Pop Gesture Recognizer right here. So I'm not super worried about this one. We know the issue is somewhere later in the process. I'm gonna go ahead and hit continue. And now we have another call set which we haven't seen before, which is in that same navigation control that we are already looking at. There's a new function called Enable Swipe to Pop Animation. That could be interesting. I'm gonna go ahead and hit continue and see if there's any more. Looks like at least one more. We'll look at the backtrace. And this is in WDPR Dine Reservations Base Hybrid View Controller View Will Appear, which seems like a strange place to me to be calling this gesture recognizer. So I'm super curious what that method's doing. I'm gonna go ahead and create a new IDA instance. And back in Finder, this is a new module called WDPR Dining Reservations. So we'll go ahead and click into that, and then we should be able to find the binary for this framework, and we'll go ahead and disassemble it. Now we're looking for base hybrid view controller view will appear. So same as before, I'm gonna go ahead and set up a filter, and I'm just gonna paste in that method name, and we have one result, which is perfect. And now I'm gonna go ahead and look at the implementation for this method. And here we can see our call to interactive pop gesture recognizer. And it looks like we're actually calling set enabled on it based on this IVAR called is navigation bar hidden. And that seems super weird to me. So this is in view will appear. So I believe this is when the view controller that we're popping back to is appearing. And when that view controller is appearing, it asks the navigation controller for its pop gesture recognizer. And it will conditionally set that to enabled or disabled based on whether or not its navigation bar is hidden. So I wonder if that's what's happening here. We start the swipe and then we run through this code and it ends up disabling this gesture recognizer. And that means that the transition cannot finish and we're left in this bad state. And that's super fun if so. I think what this is trying to do is disable swipes once this view controller has actually appeared based on whether or not its navigation bar is visible. But instead it might be disabling swipes while we're swiping. And clearly that puts us in a bad spot. That's all theory so far, so let's see if we can test it. So I think what we can do is swizzle this method very similar to the setup we have already. In fact, I'm just going to update our existing code to look at this new class and method. So now we're swizzling this base hybrid view controller's view will appear method. And let's see, what we really want to do is just not call set enabled here. But that's not a thing we can super easily do with swizzling. But what we can do instead is set up a swizzle on UI gesture recognizer, where we can provide our own implementation of this set enabled method that's being called. And what we can do is create a Boolean value. And if that Boolean value is set, then just skip the normal implementation and don't do anything. And otherwise we can call out to the normal implementation. And then that puts us in a good spot for up here in view will appear, where we set that Boolean value to yes, and then call our original implementation, and then set that value back to no. And what this means is that UI gesture recognizer set enabled will behave the same way most of the time, but when we're going through the original implementation of this view controller's view will appear, we will effectively disable calls to set enabled on gesture recognizers. This isn't the cleanest thing, but it should be enough to see if it works. So I'm gonna go ahead and build one more time. And now that new version is installing and we can go ahead and restart the app. Okay, so same thing as before, we're gonna get a list of restaurants and then we're gonna try to swipe back from one. I think that might have been it. Let's try another one. That's amazing. I have never been so excited to just be able to navigate through an app before. Okay, so I think we figured it out. That was indeed the issue. The issue is not on this page itself, but it is on this page that we are navigating back to. On its view will appear, which is triggered right when we start that swipe. It goes and it gets that gesture recognizer that's handling the swipe and it disables it. So the fix is to remove this call to enable or disable this gesture recognizer. And again, I suspect what this is trying to do is disable the gesture recognizer once we're actually on this page. So probably what we want to do instead is handle that in gesture recognizer should begin, similar similar to what the other view controller we saw was already doing. But that's a problem for someone who actually works on this app. For us, I think we can call this fixed. So thanks for walking through it with me. I want to do more third-party app investigations like this, and again, this is a brand new channel. This is only the third video here. Consider liking, subscribing, sharing it with your iOS friends. But until next time, thanks again for watching. Can't believe we actually fixed that. That's so cool.